The sun hung mercilessly over the New Mexico territory, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. It was the kind of heat that made men question their sanity for settling in such a godforsaken place. Yet, Thomas McKenna had called this harsh land home for nearly 15 years. He wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he loaded supplies onto his wagon outside Hartwell's general store, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of flour sacks and ammunition boxes. Thomas was a man of 42, with calloused hands that spoke of honest labor and grey eyes that had seen too much violence for one lifetime. His ranch, the Double M, sprawled across 3,000 acres of scrubland and rocky mesas, where he raised cattle and horses with the help of 2 Mexican vaqueros and his foreman, a grizzled former cavalry sergeant named Pete Garrison. The ranch had prospered, despite the constant threat of Apache raids, drought, and the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers over water rights. The year was 1878, and the Apache Wars had been raging intermittently for decades. Most of the tribes had been forced onto reservations, but small bands of warriors still roamed the territory, striking at isolated homesteads and wagon trains before melting back into the mountains like smoke. The people of Copper Ridge lived with a constant undercurrent of fear, their eyes always scanning the horizons for signs of trouble. As Thomas secured the last of his supplies, he noticed a commotion near the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered around something or someone, their voices rising in heated discussion. Sheriff Jake Morrison, a stocky man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, stood at the center of the group, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. Thomas had known Morrison for years and respected him as a fair lawman, though the sheriff had grown increasingly bitter since his son was killed in an Apache raid 3 years prior. Curiosity getting the better of him, Thomas approached the crowd. As he drew closer, he could see what had captured everyone's attention. Sitting in the dust outside the sheriff's office was an Apache woman, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, despite her obvious exhaustion. Her clothing was a mixture of traditional Apache dress and worn calico fabric, suggesting she had been living between 2 worlds. The woman's hands were bound with rope, and dried blood stained her left sleeve. Despite her obvious distress, she sat with a dignity that impressed Thomas. There was no begging or pleading in her posture, no signs of the broken spirit he might have expected from a captive. Instead, she observed the hostile faces surrounding her with the calm assessment of someone who had faced death before and survived. "Found her wandering near Devil's Canyon this morning," Sheriff Morrison was explaining to the crowd. "Looks like she's been on her own for days, maybe weeks. Question is, what do we do with her?" "Hang her," called out Jeremiah Watts, the town's blacksmith, his voice thick with hatred. "Damn Apaches killed my brother-in-law up near Silver City last month. Only good Indian is a dead Indian, I say." Several voices murmured agreement, but Thomas noticed that not everyone in the crowd seemed convinced. Doc Martinez, the town's physician, looked troubled by the suggestion, as did Sarah Beth Hartwell, the storekeeper's daughter, who had always been known for her compassionate nature. "Now hold on, Jeremiah," Doc Martinez interjected, his Mexican accent lending gravity to his words. "We don't know what this woman has done, if anything. Could be she's running from her own people, could be she's sick or injured. I should examine her before we make any hasty decisions." Sheriff Morrison nodded grudgingly. "Doc's got a point, but I'm not taking any chances. She stays locked up until we figure out what's what." Thomas found himself studying the Apache woman more closely. Something about her situation stirred a memory from his past, a time when he had been the one in need of mercy from strangers. During the war between the states, he had served with the Union Army and had been captured by Confederate forces after the Battle of Glorieta Pass, right here in New Mexico territory. For 3 months, he had been held in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, where disease and malnutrition had nearly killed him. It was the kindness of a Confederate sergeant's wife, a woman named Rebecca, who had smuggled him extra food and medicine that had kept him alive long enough to be exchanged. That experience had taught Thomas that humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries of race and nationality. Looking at the Apache woman now, he saw not an enemy, but a fellow human being in distress. The crowd's bloodthirsty murmurs reminded him too much of the lynch mobs he had heard about in the South after the war, and the comparison made his stomach turn. "Sheriff," Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the hostile chatter. "I'd like to speak with you privately." Morrison looked surprised but nodded. "All right, Tom, rest of you folks clear out. Show's over for now." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, with many casting suspicious glances back at the Apache woman. Thomas noticed that she seemed to understand English, as her eyes had tracked the conversation despite no one addressing her directly. This suggested she had spent considerable time around white settlements, which raised interesting questions about her background. When they were alone except for the prisoner, Sheriff Morrison turned to Thomas with a questioning look. "What's on your mind, Tom? You're not going to tell me you think we should just let her go, are you?" "I'm thinking we need more information before we do anything permanent," Thomas replied carefully. "You said you found her near Devil's Canyon. That's rough country, miles from any Apache settlement I know of. What was she doing out there alone?" Morrison shrugged. "Could be scouting for a raiding party. Could be she got separated from her band. Hell, could be she's running from the law herself. Point is, we can't trust her." Thomas glanced at the woman, who continued to sit in dignified silence despite the heat and her obvious discomfort. "Has she said anything? Made any threats or demands?" "Not a word. Been silent as the grave since I brought her in. Mind if I try talking to her?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Why would you want to do that, Tom? You know what her people did to the Patterson family last spring, burned them out, killed the father and oldest son. You want to make conversation with someone who might have been part of that?" Thomas understood Morrison's anger and suspicion. The Apache raids had claimed many lives over the years, creating deep wells of hatred and mistrust on both sides. But he also knew that treating every Apache as a bloodthirsty savage was both morally wrong and strategically foolish. The territory would never know peace until people learned to see past their prejudices. "Jake, you know me. I've fought Apaches when they've raided my stock, and I've lost good men to their war parties. But I've also traded with peaceful bands, and I know there are good people among them, just like there are bad people among us. This woman doesn't look like a warrior to me. She looks like someone who's been through hell and needs help." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face. Finally, he sighed. "All right, Tom, you can try talking to her, but I'm staying right here, and my gun stays handy." Thomas approached the Apache woman slowly, his hands visible and empty. He crouched down a few feet away from her, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but clear. "My name is Thomas McKenna. I own a ranch east of town. Do you understand English?" The woman's dark eyes met his for the first time, and Thomas was struck by the intelligence he saw there. After a moment, she nodded slightly. "Are you hurt? Do you need water or food?" Again, a small nod, this time accompanied by the first hint of hope he had seen in her expression. Thomas turned to Morrison. "Jake, she needs water at least, and Doc Martinez should look at that arm." "Tom, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but she's a human being, Jake. Whatever else she might be, she's a person who's suffering right now. Would you deny water to a wounded dog?" Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded grudgingly. "Sarah Beth, bring some water from the well," he called to the storekeeper's daughter, who had been lingering nearby despite the crowd's dispersal. Sarah Beth hurried off and returned quickly with a tin cup filled with cool water. Thomas took it and offered it to the Apache woman, who accepted it gratefully. She drank slowly, savoring each sip, and Thomas noticed that her hands shook slightly from exhaustion or shock. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. The woman finished drinking and handed back the cup. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear, with only a slight accent. "I am called Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language." Thomas was surprised by how well she spoke English. "Ayana, That's a beautiful name. How long have you been alone out there? 12 days, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe 13. Time becomes difficult to measure. Sheriff Morrison stepped closer, his hand still on his gun. 12 days doing what? Scouting our defenses, planning raids. Ayana's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or pain. I was not scouting. She paused, as if searching for the right words. I was cast out. Cast out, Thomas prompted gently. By your own people. Ayana nodded, and for the first time Thomas saw vulnerability in her stoic facade. My husband was killed in a raid on a Mexican settlement 6 months ago. The elders blamed me for his death. They said I carried bad medicine, that my presence brought misfortune to the band. 3 weeks ago, they told me to leave and never return. Morrison scoffed. Convenient story. How do we know you're not lying? But Thomas found himself believing her. There was something in her tone, a weight of genuine grief and abandonment that would be difficult to fake. He had heard stories of Apache customs regarding widows, particularly those who were seen as unlucky. In a culture that lived constantly on the edge of survival, superstition often played a powerful role in decision-making. Where have you been living since then? Thomas asked. In the canyons, the hidden places. I know this land well from childhood, but the water sources are drying up with the summer heat and the game is scarce. I was looking for a place to die with dignity when your lawman found me. The stark honesty of her admission struck Thomas like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had been rejected by her own people, left to survive alone in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and she faced her fate with more courage than most men he knew. Doc Martinez approached the group, his medical bag in hand. Sheriff, if you're done with your interrogation, I'd like to examine the patient. She looks dehydrated, and that wound needs attention. Morrison looked conflicted. I suppose there's no harm in making sure she doesn't die on us before we decide what to do with her. As Doc Martinez knelt beside Ayana and began to examine her injured arm, Thomas found himself making a decision that would change his life forever. He had been alone on his ranch for too many years, carrying the weight of old sorrows and missed opportunities. His wife, Margaret, had died of consumption 8 years earlier, taking with her any dreams of children or the kind of family life he had once imagined. Since then, he had thrown himself into his work, building his ranch into one of the most successful operations in the territory, but success had brought him little joy. Looking at Ayana now, seeing her dignity in the face of abandonment and death, Thomas recognized something of himself. They were both survivors, both people who had lost everything that mattered and had been forced to rebuild their lives from nothing. Perhaps they could find in each other what they had lost elsewhere. Doc, how is she? Thomas asked as Martinez finished his examination. Dehydrated, malnourished, and she has a deep cut on her arm that's showing signs of infection. Nothing that can't be treated, but she needs rest, food, and clean water. This woman has been through an ordeal that would have killed most people. Sheriff Morrison shook his head. That's all very touching, but we still have the question of what to do with her. I can't just turn her loose, and I can't keep her in my jail indefinitely. The townspeople are already calling for her head. Thomas took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would set him on a path he couldn't take back. I'll take responsibility for her. Both Morrison and Doc Martinez stared at him in shock. Tom, what are you saying? Morrison asked. I'm saying I'll take her to my ranch. I'll vouch for her behavior and make sure she doesn't cause any trouble. She can work for her keep and earn an honest living instead of dying in the desert or swinging from a rope. Morrison's face darkened. Tom, have you lost your mind? You want to take an Apache woman to your ranch. Your hands will quit, your neighbors will think you've gone soft, and you'll have every raiding party in the territory thinking you're sympathetic to their cause. Maybe. Or maybe I'll be setting an example of what this territory could become if people learned to judge individuals instead of entire races. Doc Martinez looked thoughtful. It's not without precedent. I've heard of Apache women marrying into Mexican and Anglo families, particularly those who were raised in missions or spent time as captives. If she's truly been cast out by her people, She's not going to be passing information to war parties. Ayana had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. The idea that a white rancher would risk his reputation and safety to help her seemed impossible, yet the sincerity in Thomas's voice was unmistakable. She studied his face, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only genuine concern and determination. "Why?" she asked Thomas directly. "Why would you do this for someone you don't know?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I've been where you are. Maybe not exactly the same circumstances, but I've been alone and facing death with nowhere to turn. Someone showed me kindness when they didn't have to, and it saved my life. I reckon it's time I pass that kindness along." Sheriff Morrison shook his head, but seemed to be wavering. "Tom, even if I agreed to this crazy idea, what makes you think she'd come with you? For all we know, she'd rather die free than live as a prisoner on your ranch." Thomas turned to Ayana. "It wouldn't be as a prisoner. You'd be a worker, earning your keep same as anyone else. You'd have a place to sleep, food to eat, and the chance to make a new life for yourself. But it would be your choice." Ayana was silent for a long time, weighing her options. Death in the desert was certain. Death at the hands of the townspeople was likely. But this strange white man was offering her something she had thought lost forever: hope. The decision should have been easy, but accepting his help would mean abandoning any possibility of ever returning to her people, even if they would have her back. "If I come with you," she said finally, "what would be expected of me?" "Honest work. I run cattle and horses, and there's always more to do than hands to do it. You could help with the horses. I notice you have a way with them from how you've been watching mine. You could assist my cook Pedro with meals for the crew. There's mending and cleaning and 100 other tasks that keep a ranch running." "And if I try to leave?" Thomas met her eyes steadily. "Then you leave. I'm not offering to make you a prisoner, Ayana. I'm offering you a chance to build a new life, but it has to be a life you choose." The weight of the decision pressed down on Ayana like a physical force. She thought of her husband, Nalnish, who had been so proud and fierce, who had dreamed of driving the white settlers from Apache land forever. He would have been horrified by the idea of his wife working for a white rancher. But Nalnish was dead, killed in a futile raid that had accomplished nothing except creating more orphans and widows on both sides. She thought of the band that had cast her out, the people she had known since childhood, who had turned their backs on her in her time of greatest need. The old ways were dying, crushed under the weight of superior numbers and technology. Perhaps it was time to find new ways to survive. "I will come with you," she said quietly. "But I will not be your slave or your woman. I work for wages, like any hand." Thomas nodded. "Fair wages for fair work. That's how I've always operated." Sheriff Morrison threw up his hands in exasperation. "Tom, you're making a mistake that could get you killed, but I've known you long enough to recognize that look in your eyes. You've made up your mind, haven't you?" "I have." "Then God help you both." Morrison turned to Ayana. "Woman, you listen to me good. If there's so much as a whisper of trouble from any Apache band that can be traced back to you, if a single cow goes missing or a fence gets cut, I'll hold you responsible. And Tom's protection won't save you then." Ayana met his hard stare without flinching. "I understand. I want no part of raiding or killing. That life is behind me now." Doc Martinez finished bandaging her arm and packed his supplies. "She'll need rest and good food for a few weeks to get her strength back. And this bandage should be changed every day until the infection clears up." "I'll see to it," Thomas promised. He helped Ayana to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly from exhaustion. "Can you ride?" "Yes, I have been riding since I could walk." Thomas untied one of his horses from the wagon, a gentle mare named Rosie that he often used for training young riders. "She's got an easy gait and a calm temperament." "Think you can manage her?" Ayana approached the horse slowly, speaking to it in low, musical tones in the Apache language. The mare's ears pricked forward with interest, and within moments she was nuzzling Ayana's shoulder with obvious affection. Thomas was impressed despite himself. He had seen few people, white or Indian, who had such an immediate connection with horses. As Ayana mounted the mare with practiced ease, a small crowd began to gather again. Word had spread quickly through the town about Thomas's unusual decision, and the reactions ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Jeremiah Watts pushed to the front of the group, his face red with anger. "McKenna, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just take that savage to your ranch. What about the safety of decent folks?" "Jeremiah, Ayana here isn't a threat to anyone. She's a woman who needs help, nothing more." "That's what they all say until they cut your throat in your sleep," another voice called from the crowd. Thomas felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "I've made my decision, and it's final. Anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me personally." The crowd muttered among themselves, but no one seemed willing to challenge Thomas directly. He was known as a fair man, but also one who could handle himself in a fight. His reputation for straight dealing and personal courage had earned him respect, even from those who disagreed with his choices. As Thomas climbed onto his wagon and prepared to leave town with Ayana, Sarah Beth Hartwell approached with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. McKenna, I thought your guest might need some proper clothes. These belonged to my sister before she got married and moved to California. They should fit well enough." Thomas accepted the bundle gratefully. "That's very kind of you, Sarah Beth. I'll make sure they're put to good use." The young woman glanced at Ayana with shy curiosity. "Ma'am, I hope things work out well for you at the Double M. Mr. McKenna is a good man who'll treat you fair." Ayana inclined her head graciously. "Thank you for your kindness. It will not be forgotten." As they rode out of Copper Ridge, Thomas could feel the weight of stares following them. He knew that news of his decision would spread throughout the territory within days. Carried by traders, cowboys, and traveling preachers, some would call him a fool, others a traitor to his own race. But as he glanced at Ayana riding beside him, her back straight despite her exhaustion, he felt confident that he had made the right choice. The ride to the Double M took them through some of the most beautiful and harsh country in New Mexico territory. Red mesas rose like ancient fortresses from the desert floor, their tops crowned with twisted piñon pines and juniper trees. In the distance, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains shimmered in the afternoon heat, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer season. Ayana rode in silence for most of the journey, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to read the land for signs of danger or opportunity. Thomas found himself studying her profile, noting the strength in her features and the way she seemed to become part of the horse she rode, rather than simply sitting on its back. As they crested a rise about 5 miles from town, the Double M spread out before them in the valley below. The ranch headquarters consisted of a large adobe house with thick walls and a red tile roof, surrounded by corrals, barns, and outbuildings. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze, pumping water into stock tanks that glittered like silver mirrors in the sun. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, fat and content despite the harsh climate. "There it is," Thomas said with obvious pride. "Home." Ayana studied the layout with the eye of someone who understood the challenges of surviving in this environment. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and water sources. The corrals were well built and spacious, designed to handle large numbers of horses and cattle. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work over many years. "It is impressive," she said honestly. "You have built something good here." "Thank you. It's taken 15 years and more sweat than I care to remember, but it's been worth it." As they approached the ranch buildings, several men emerged to greet them. Thomas could see the surprise and suspicion on their faces as they noticed Ayana, but their respect for him kept them from voicing immediate objections. Pete Garrison, the foreman, was a weathered man in his 50s with graying hair and the bearing of an old soldier. He had served with Thomas during the war and had been one of the first men hired when the ranch was established. His loyalty was unquestioned, but Thomas could see the concern in his eyes as he approached. "Boss, we weren't expecting you back so early. Everything go all right in town?" "Just fine, Pete. I'd like you to meet Ayana. She'll be working with us for a while, helping with the horses and general ranch work." Pete's eyes flicked between Thomas and Ayana, clearly processing the implications. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat, "welcome to the Double M." The other hands, Carlos Mendoza and his nephew Miguel, both experienced vaqueros from Sonora, seemed less certain about the situation. Carlos was a man of about 40, with a magnificent mustache and hands that could gentle the wildest bronco. Miguel, barely 20, was learning the trade under his uncle's guidance and had the enthusiasm of youth combined with genuine skill with horses. "Patron," Carlos said carefully, "is there anything we should know about this arrangement?" Thomas appreciated Carlos's diplomacy in not voicing his concerns more directly. "Ayana is under my protection, Carlos. She's had some troubles with her own people and needs a place to start over. I'm counting on all of you to treat her with the respect you'd show any member of this crew." Carlos nodded slowly. "See, Patron, if you vouch for her, that is enough for us." Beep, but Thomas could see the uncertainty in Miguel's young face, and he knew there would be challenges ahead. The territory was still too raw, the wounds from years of warfare too fresh, for this arrangement to be accepted without question. Still, his men were good people who would follow his lead as long as he remained firm in his convictions. Pedro Vasquez, the ranch cook, emerged from the kitchen with flour on his apron and a curious expression on his weathered face. Pedro was a small, energetic man who had been cooking for ranch crews and army units for 30 years. His food was legendary throughout the territory, and his loyalty to Thomas was absolute. "Senor Tom, you bring a guest for dinner. I can always make more frijoles." "Pedro, meet Ayana. She'll be staying with us and working around the ranch. I was hoping you might show her the ropes in the kitchen, maybe teach her some of your secrets." Pedro's dark eyes studied Ayana with interest rather than suspicion. "Ah, see, I can always use help with the cooking. These vaqueros, they eat like wolves, always hungry, always complaining if the biscuits are not perfect." Ayana smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth Thomas had seen from her. "I would be honored to learn from you, senor. My grandmother taught me to cook many things, but I suspect your methods are different from ours." "Different, perhaps, but all good cooking comes from the heart, no? Come, I show you where you can wash and rest. You look like you have traveled far." As Pedro led Ayana toward the house, Thomas called after them. "Pedro, set her up in the small room off the kitchen. It's got its own entrance and should give her some privacy." The room Thomas referred to had originally been designed as quarters for a housekeeper back when he had hoped Margaret might live long enough to need such help. It was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the horse corrals. Most importantly, it would allow Ayana to come and go without having to walk through the main house, giving her independence while keeping her close enough for protection if needed. Pete Garrison lingered after the others had dispersed, clearly wanting to speak privately with Thomas. When they were alone, he removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Tom, I've followed you through some pretty questionable decisions over the years, and you've always proven to be right in the end. But I've got to ask, are you sure about this? Taking in an Apache woman at this particular time might not be the smartest move you've ever made." Thomas understood Pete's concerns. The old soldier had seen enough warfare to know how quickly situations could escalate, and he felt responsible for the safety of the entire crew. His questions came from loyalty, not prejudice. "Pete, I know it looks risky, hell, it is risky, but I've got a feeling about this woman. She's not what people expect, and she's been through more than most folks could handle. Sometimes you've got to trust your instincts about people. And if your instincts are wrong, if she's playing some kind of long game..." Thomas considered the question seriously. "Then I'll deal with the consequences, but I don't think I'm wrong about her. You saw how she handled Rosie? That's not something you can fake. And the way she spoke to Pedro, showing respect for his position and experience. Those are the actions of someone who understands how to fit into a community." Pete nodded slowly. "All right, boss. You've earned my trust over the years, and you'll have it now. But I'm going to keep my eyes open, and I suggest you do the same. I wouldn't expect anything less." As evening approached, Thomas found himself alone on the front porch of his house, watching the sun set over the western mountains. The sky blazed with colors that seemed too vivid to be real, deep purples and brilliant oranges that gradually faded to soft pinks and golds. It was a sight that never grew old, no matter how many times he witnessed it. From the kitchen came the sounds of dinner preparation, Pedro's voice mixing with Ayana's in what seemed to be an animated discussion about spices and cooking techniques. The normalcy of the scene struck Thomas as remarkable, considering the dramatic events of the day. He thought about the decision he had made and the reactions it would likely provoke throughout the territory. There would be those who saw his actions as weakness or betrayal, and others who might view them as dangerous precedent-setting. But Thomas had learned long ago that living according to other people's expectations was a sure path to misery and regret. Margaret had taught him that lesson during their brief but happy marriage. She had been a schoolteacher from Boston who had come west to bring education to frontier children, shocking her family and social circle with her unconventional choice. When she met Thomas, many people had questioned whether a rough rancher and a refined Eastern woman could ever build a life together. But their love had transcended those differences, creating something beautiful and strong that had sustained them through years of hardship. After Margaret's death, Thomas had withdrawn from most social connections, pouring his energy into building the ranch and trying to forget the pain of loss. But watching Ayana's quiet dignity in the face of abandonment and hostility had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long, the desire to make a difference in someone else's life, to offer hope where there had been only despair. The dinner bell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Pedro had insisted on preparing a special meal to welcome their new crew member, and the kitchen table was laden with his finest efforts. Tender beefsteaks grilled over mesquite coals, fresh tortillas, beans seasoned with chilies and cumin, and vegetables from the small garden Pedro maintained behind the kitchen. The crew gathered around the long wooden table that dominated the kitchen, their usual easy camaraderie somewhat strained by Ayana's presence. But Pedro's enthusiasm was infectious, and gradually the men began to relax as the old cook regaled them with stories of other meals he had prepared for other crews in other places. Ayana ate quietly, observing the interactions around the table with the careful attention of someone learning new social dynamics. Thomas noticed that she was particularly interested in the relationship between Carlos and Miguel, the older man's patient guidance of his nephew clearly striking a chord with her own memories of family bonds. "Ayana," Thomas said during a lull in the conversation, "Pedro tells me you've been sharing some interesting recipes with him. Sounds like you know your way around a kitchen." "My grandmother was considered the best cook in our band," Ayana replied. "She taught me to prepare food that would sustain warriors on long journeys and to make use of every part of any animal we hunted. Waste was considered both foolish and disrespectful to the spirits that provided for us." Miguel looked up with interest. "That sounds like what my grandmother always said. She could make a feast from things most people would throw away." "Food is life," Ayana said simply. "To waste it is to waste the life that was given to provide it." Pedro nodded approvingly. "Exactamente. This is what I try to teach these cowboys, but they think only of filling their bellies, not of honoring what they eat." Carlos smiled. "Pedro, you know we appreciate your cooking. We just show it by eating everything you put in front of us." The conversation continued in this vein, gradually becoming more natural as the shared experience of the meal broke down some of the initial barriers. Thomas found himself watching Ayana with growing admiration for the way she navigated the social complexities of the situation. She spoke when spoken to, but didn't force herself into conversations, showed appropriate respect for the established hierarchy of the crew, and demonstrated genuine interest in learning about their customs and expectations. After dinner, Pete asked Thomas to join him for a walk around the corrals to check on the horses. It was a routine they had followed for years, but tonight Thomas sensed that his foreman had something specific on his mind. "She seems to know what she's about," Pete said as they paused by the fence where several horses stood quietly in the evening air. "I watched her during dinner and she's got good manners and common sense. But Tom, we're going to face some challenges with the other ranchers and the folks in town." Thomas had been thinking about the same issues. "What kind of challenges specifically?" "Well, for starters, Jim Patterson is still looking for someone to blame for what happened to his family. He's been talking about organizing some kind of vigilance committee to deal with any Indians found off the reservation. Having Ayana here might make his operation a target." Patterson was a neighboring rancher whose father and brother had been killed in an Apache raid the previous spring. Thomas understood the man's anger and grief, but he also knew that Patterson's desire for revenge was making him dangerous and unpredictable. "What about the other ranchers? Any word on how they're likely to react?" "Mixed, I'd say. Ed Morrison, the sheriff's brother, thinks you've lost your mind, but he's not likely to cause trouble directly. Frank Stevens over at the Circle S seems curious more than anything. Says he's heard of Apache women making good ranch hands if they're treated right. But Bob Wheeler is telling anyone who'll listen that you're encouraging Indian raids by harboring hostiles." Thomas sighed. Wheeler was a small-time rancher with big-time ambitions and a talent for stirring up trouble when it served his purposes. "Wheeler's got his own agenda. He's been trying to buy my water rights for 2 years, and he's probably hoping this situation will put enough pressure on me to force a sale." "Could be. But the point is, we're going to be dealing with more than just curious stares and gossip. Some folks are going to see this as a test case, a way to make a statement about how Indians should be treated in the territory." Thomas appreciated Pete's analysis. The old soldier had a talent for seeing the broader implications of any situation, a skill that had served them well in both war and peace. "So what do you think we should do about it?" Thomas asked. "We stay alert, keep our weapons handy, and make sure Ayana understands the risks she's facing by being here. If trouble comes, we'll deal with it the same way we've always dealt with problems, together, as a crew." Thomas nodded, feeling grateful once again for Pete's unwavering loyalty. "I'll talk to her tomorrow, make sure she knows what she might be getting into." As they completed their circuit of the corrals, Thomas noticed a light still burning in the small window of Ayana's room. He wondered what she was thinking about her first day at the Double M, whether she was having second thoughts about accepting his offer of sanctuary. The transition from her old life to this new one couldn't be easy, especially when she was surrounded by people who had every reason to distrust her. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a crisp breeze that promised another scorching day once the sun climbed higher. Thomas rose early, as was his habit, and found Pedro already at work in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the crew. The old cook was humming quietly as he worked, a good sign that he was pleased with how things were going. "Buenos dias, Pedro. How did our new helper work out yesterday evening?" Pedro's weathered face creased into a smile. "Ah, Senor Tom, she is very good, very quick to learn, and she knows things about plants and herbs that even my grandmother never taught me. She showed me how to make a tea from desert sage that settles the stomach better than anything I know." "Where is she now?" "Already up and working with the horses. She said she wanted to earn her place here, not just talk about it." Thomas stepped outside and walked toward the corrals, where he could see Ayana working with a young colt that had been giving the crew trouble for weeks. The animal was notorious for his skittish behavior and refusal to accept a halter, but as Thomas watched, Ayana seemed to be making remarkable progress with him. She moved slowly and deliberately, speaking to the colt in low, musical tones that seemed to calm his nervous energy. Her approach was different from anything Thomas had seen before, less about dominance and control, more about building trust and understanding. Within minutes, she had the halter on the colt and was leading him around the corral as if they had been working together for months. Carlos Mendoza appeared at Thomas's elbow, shaking his head in amazement. Patron, I have been working with horses for 20 years, and I have never seen anything like this. She has some kind of gift. Looks that way. Think you could learn anything from her methods? Carlos nodded enthusiastically. See, I would be honored to learn from her. This approach, it is more like what my grandfather used to do before we started using the Anglo methods of breaking horses. Thomas found Carlos's response encouraging. If the experienced vaquero was willing to acknowledge Ayana's skills and learn from her, it would go a long way toward establishing her credibility with the rest of the crew. As the morning progressed, Thomas had numerous opportunities to observe Ayana at work. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that extended beyond horses to cattle, dogs, and even the chickens that roamed the ranch yard. More importantly, she approached every task with a quiet competence that gradually won the respect of the other workers. At midday, Thomas asked her to join him on the front porch for a private conversation. He wanted to make sure she understood the potential dangers of her situation and give her another chance to reconsider her decision to stay. Ayana, I need to be honest with you about something. My decision to bring you here hasn't been popular with some folks in the territory. There might be people who try to cause trouble for you or for the ranch because you're here. Ayana met his gaze steadily. I expected this. Hatred runs deep on both sides, and there are those who profit from keeping the wounds open. You don't seem surprised. I have lived long enough to understand how fear makes people act. Your people fear mine because we represent the wilderness they are trying to tame. My people fear yours because you represent the end of everything we have known for generations. Fear makes both sides do foolish things. Thomas was struck by the wisdom in her words. Do you regret coming here? It's not too late to change your mind. Ayana was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes scanning the landscape that stretched toward the distant mountains. Mr. McKenna, do you know what it means to be caught between two worlds? To belong fully to neither? I think I might understand something about that. My husband believed that our people could drive out all the white settlers if we fought hard enough, killed enough of you. He died believing that, and many others have died believing the same thing. But I have seen the wagon trains, the soldiers, the cities that spring up like weeds after rain. We cannot win this war through violence. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I have also seen that not all white people are our enemies, just as not all Apache are bloodthirsty savages. Perhaps there is another way, a path that leads somewhere other than mutual destruction. Thomas found himself impressed by her perspective. You think working here, proving that Apache and Anglo can live together peacefully, might be a step toward that other path? I think it is worth trying. And if it fails, if I am killed for being here, or you are ruined for sheltering me, at least we will have tried something different than hatred and revenge. Her words carried a weight of conviction that moved Thomas deeply. Here was a woman who had lost everything, husband, family, home, identity, yet still possessed the courage to hope for a better future. Her presence at the ranch was indeed a risk, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate that the cycle of violence and retribution could be broken. All right then, Thomas said. We'll face whatever comes together, but I want you to promise me something. What is that? If things get dangerous, if you think your life is in immediate peril, you'll come to me immediately. Don't try to handle it alone. Ayana nodded. I promise. And Mr. McKenna, call me Thomas. We're partners in this enterprise now. Thomas, then, I want you to know that I will not bring shame to your kindness. I will work as hard as any man you employ, and I will defend this ranch as fiercely as if it were my own land. Over the following days, Ayana settled into the rhythm of ranch life with remarkable ease. She proved to be extraordinarily capable with horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and skill that amazed the experienced vaqueros. She also demonstrated a talent for tracking and reading sign that proved invaluable when cattle wandered off or predators threatened the herds. But perhaps most importantly, she began to form genuine friendships with the other members of the crew. Pedro delighted in teaching her new recipes while learning traditional Apache methods of preserving meat and preparing medicinal teas. Carlos and Miguel found her knowledge of desert survival invaluable, especially her ability to locate water sources and identify edible plants. Even Pete Garrison, initially the most skeptical of the crew, came to appreciate her contributions. When a pack of wolves began harassing the cattle, Ayana was able to track their movements and predict their hunting patterns with an accuracy that allowed the ranch hands to protect the herds effectively without resorting to expensive and time-consuming night patrols. 2 weeks after Ayana's arrival, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Frank Stevens, owner of the Circle S Ranch, rode up to the house on a hot Tuesday afternoon, his face grim with serious news. "Tom, we need to talk. There's been developments you should know about." Thomas invited Frank into the house and offered him coffee, noting the tension in the other man's manner. Frank was a straight-talking rancher who had earned Thomas's respect over the years, not given to panic or exaggeration. "What's on your mind, Frank?" "It's about your Apache woman. Word's gotten back to the territorial capital about your arrangement here. Governor Wallace is sending a federal marshal to investigate the situation." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Territorial politics were complicated and often brutal, with various factions vying for control and influence. Having federal attention focused on the ranch could create problems that went far beyond local prejudice. "Any idea what kind of investigation we're talking about?" "Marshall's name is Daniel Crawford. I've heard of him. He's got a reputation for being fair, but thorough. Problem is, he's under pressure from some powerful folks in Santa Fe who think harboring Indians off the reservation sets a dangerous precedent." Thomas rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "When's he supposed to arrive?" "Could be any day now." "Tom, I came to warn you because I respect what you're trying to do here. But you need to understand that there are people who see this as a test case. If they can make an example of you, it sends a message to anyone else who might be thinking about similar arrangements." "What kind of example?" Frank's expression darkened. "The kind that involves confiscating your ranch and sending you to federal prison for harboring fugitive Indians. They're talking about charging you under the Indian Intercourse Act, claiming you're providing aid and comfort to hostiles." That is, the Indian Intercourse Act was a federal law designed to regulate contact between whites and Native Americans, particularly in regard to trade and settlement issues. It had been used in the past to prosecute people who were accused of encouraging Indian resistance or providing weapons and supplies to hostile tribes. Frank, Ayana isn't a hostile. She's a woman who was cast out by her own people and was dying in the desert when I found her. I believe you, Tom. But the law doesn't always care about individual circumstances when there's political pressure involved. You need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll try to make this stick regardless of the facts. After Frank left, Thomas called the crew together to explain the situation. He wanted everyone to understand what they might be facing and give them the opportunity to distance themselves from the ranch if they felt it was necessary. "Boys, we might have some federal trouble coming our way. Anyone who wants to draw his pay and move on, no hard feelings." Pete Garrison spoke for the group. "Boss, we've been through tough times before. If you're staying, we're staying." Carlos nodded his agreement. "Si, patron, this is our home too." But Thomas knew that Ayana faced the greatest danger. If Marshal Crawford decided to pursue charges, she could be arrested and sent to a reservation hundreds of miles away or worse. He found her working in the horse corral and explained Frank's warning. "You have a choice to make," he told her. "You can leave now, head into Mexico, or try to find another Apache band that might take you in. Or you can stay and face whatever the federal government decides to throw at us." Ayana continued, brushing the horse she had been grooming, her movement steady and unhurried. "Thomas, do you remember what I told you about being caught between two worlds?" "I remember. If I run now, I will spend the rest of my life running. I will never belong anywhere, never have a home, never be anything more than a fugitive hiding in the shadows." But if I stay and face this marshal, if I tell the truth about who I am and why I am here, perhaps something good can come from it." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "It's risky, Ayana. These federal marshals have a lot of power, and the political climate isn't favorable to our cause." Bill, when has the political climate ever been favorable to Apache people? We have survived by adapting, by finding ways to endure even when the world around us changes. This is just another test of that survival. Her determination was infectious, strengthening Thomas's own resolve to see this through regardless of the consequences. "All right then. We'll face Marshal Crawford together and let the truth speak for itself." 3 days later, on a blistering hot Friday morning, Daniel Crawford arrived at the Double M Ranch. He was a tall, lean man in his 40s with steel-gray hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years in the saddle. His manner was professional but not hostile, and Thomas found himself cautiously optimistic about the marshal's intentions. Crawford was accompanied by a young deputy named Billy Foster, a nervous-looking man who seemed overwhelmed by the responsibility of a federal investigation. Thomas invited both men into his house and offered them refreshments, determined to establish a cooperative tone from the beginning. "Marshal Crawford, I understand you're here to investigate my employment of an Apache woman. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have." Crawford studied Thomas with intelligent gray eyes. "Mr. McKenna, I appreciate your cooperation. I've been hearing conflicting stories about this situation, and I'd like to get the facts straight. Why don't you start by telling me how you came to hire this woman?" Thomas recounted the events in Copper Ridge, describing how he found Ayana in the custody of Sheriff Morrison and the circumstances that led to his decision to offer her sanctuary. He emphasized her status as a refugee from her own people and her obvious desire to live peacefully. "And where is she now?" Crawford asked. "Working with the horses. Would you like to meet her?" "I would." Thomas led the marshal and his deputy to the corral where Ayana was training a young stallion. As before, her skill with the animal was immediately apparent, and Thomas could see Crawford's professional interest in her methods. "Ma'am," Crawford said politely, "I'm Federal Marshal Daniel Crawford. I understand you've been working here for a few weeks now." Ayana turned to face him, her posture respectful but not subservient. "Yes, Marshal. Mr. McKenna has given me the opportunity to earn an honest living. And before that, where were you living?" "I was wandering in the desert, trying to survive after being cast out by my band." Crawford questioned her for nearly an hour, asking about her background, her husband's death, the circumstances of her banishment, and her reasons for accepting Thomas's offer. Throughout the interrogation, Ayana answered honestly and directly, never attempting to evade difficult questions or present herself as anything other than what she was. Thomas watched Crawford's face during the questioning, trying to gauge the marshal's reaction to Ayana's story. The federal officer seemed genuinely interested in understanding her situation rather than simply building a case against her. After finishing with Ayana, Crawford interviewed each member of the ranch crew, asking about her behavior, her contributions to the operation, and any signs of contact with hostile Apache bands. Without exception, the men spoke positively of her character and work ethic. Finally, Crawford asked to see the ranch's employment records and financial accounts, verifying that Ayana was indeed being paid fair wages for her work and that her presence had not resulted in any suspicious activities or communications. When the formal investigation was complete, Crawford asked to speak privately with Thomas on the front porch. The marshal's expression was thoughtful rather than accusatory, giving Thomas hope that the outcome might be favorable. "Mr. McKenna, I've been a federal marshal for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of situations involving conflicts between whites and Indians. Most of them end badly for everyone involved, but not this one." Crawford was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "What you've done here is unusual, maybe even unprecedented. You've taken a significant personal and financial risk to help someone who had no claim on your assistance. More importantly, you seem to have created a situation where that help has benefited everyone involved." Thomas felt a surge of relief, but tried not to show it. "Does that mean you won't be filing charges? I'm going to recommend to the territorial governor that no action be taken against you or your employee. In my opinion, Miss Ayana represents no threat to public safety and has demonstrated genuine desire to live peacefully within white society. The Indian Intercourse Act was designed to prevent white settlers from providing aid to hostile tribes, not to punish acts of Christian charity toward individual refugees." The relief Thomas felt was overwhelming, but he managed to maintain his composure. "I appreciate your fairness, Marshal. Not everyone would have taken the time to investigate the actual facts. Mr. McKenna, there's something else you should know. Word of this situation has spread beyond New Mexico territory. There are newspapers in Denver and San Francisco that have picked up the story, and it's generating considerable discussion about Indian policy and the possibility of peaceful coexistence." Thomas was surprised by this revelation. "I had no idea it had attracted that kind of attention. Some of that attention is positive, but some isn't. There are people who see what you're doing as dangerous precedent-setting, and they may not be satisfied with my recommendation. You should be prepared for ongoing scrutiny and possible future challenges." Crawford's warning proved prophetic. Over the following weeks, the Double M Ranch received visitors from throughout the territory and beyond. Some came out of genuine curiosity about the experiment in racial cooperation taking place there. Others arrived with hostile intentions, hoping to provoke incidents that would justify federal intervention. Among the positive visitors was Dr. Samuel Richards, an ethnologist from the University of California, who was studying the cultural adaptations of Native American peoples to white society. Dr. Richards spent several days at the ranch, interviewing Ayana about her experiences and documenting her methods of horse training and animal husbandry. "Miss Ayana," Dr. Richards said during one of their conversations, "your story represents something quite remarkable. The possibility that individuals can transcend the racial and cultural barriers that seem to divide our societies. Would you be willing to share your experiences with a wider audience?" Ayana considered the question carefully. "Dr. Richards, if my story can help people understand that Apache and Anglo can live together in peace, then I am willing to tell it. But I will not be displayed like a curiosity in a traveling show." "I understand completely. I'm thinking more along the lines of written accounts, perhaps some lectures at universities where future teachers and government officials might learn from your experiences." Thomas found himself intrigued by the possibility. If Ayana's story could influence policymakers and educators, it might contribute to more enlightened approaches to Indian affairs throughout the territory. But not all the attention was welcome. Bob Wheeler, the neighboring rancher who had opposed Thomas's decision from the beginning, began organizing what he called a Committee for Public Safety, claiming that the Double M Ranch had become a haven for Indian sympathizers and potential spies. Wheeler's campaign reached a climax when he brought a group of armed men to the ranch, demanding that Ayana be turned over to them for proper questioning about her loyalties. Thomas met them at the gate, backed by his crew and carrying a shotgun. "Wheeler, this is private property, and you're not welcome here. I suggest you and your friends turn around and ride out before this gets unpleasant." Wheeler, a red-faced man with a perpetual sneer, gestured toward Ayana, who was visible working with horses in the distance. "McKenna, that woman is a threat to every decent family in this territory. You're harboring a potential spy and murderer. She's a ranch hand who's done honest work for honest pay. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, take it to the sheriff. Otherwise, get off my land." The confrontation could have escalated into violence, but Pete Garrison and Carlos Mendoza made it clear that they were prepared to defend their employer and their fellow worker. Faced with determined opposition, Wheeler's group withdrew, but Thomas knew the incident represented a dangerous escalation in the conflict. That evening, as Thomas discussed the day's events with Ayana, she made an observation that struck him as particularly insightful. "Thomas, there are people like Wheeler on both sides of this conflict. Among my people, There are those who believe that any Apache who lives peacefully with whites is a traitor who deserves death. The hatred runs so deep that it has become part of their identity. So, what do we do about it? We continue to prove them wrong, one day at a time. We show that there is another way, even if only a few people are willing to see it. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the promise of winter, Ayana had become an integral part of the Double M operation. Her skills with horses had helped the ranch develop a reputation for producing exceptionally well-trained mounts, and her knowledge of desert survival had proved invaluable during the dry summer months. More importantly, her presence had changed the entire dynamic of the crew. The men had learned to see beyond racial stereotypes, to judge individuals by their character and contributions, rather than their ancestry. It was a small step toward the kind of society Thomas believed the territory could become if people were willing to abandon their prejudices. But as winter approached, Thomas knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The political pressures that had brought Marshal Crawford to investigate were not going away, and the attention from newspapers and academics would continue to make the ranch a symbol in the broader debate about Indian policy. Standing on his front porch one evening, watching Ayana work with a particularly difficult horse, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in Copper Ridge, when he had first seen her sitting in the dust outside the sheriff's office. He had offered her sanctuary, expecting to save her life, but in doing so, he had discovered new purpose and meaning in his own existence. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his thoughts. Pete Garrison emerged from the bunkhouse, his hand resting on his gun, as a group of horsemen approached the ranch buildings. But as they drew closer, Thomas recognized the lead rider as Jim Patterson, the rancher whose family had been killed in an Apache raid. Patterson dismounted slowly, his face bearing the weight of grief and exhaustion that had marked him since his loss. Thomas approached cautiously, unsure of the man's intentions. "Jim, what brings you out here this evening?" Patterson removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Tom, I need to talk to you about something. About her." He nodded toward Ayana, who had stopped her work and was watching the conversation with obvious concern. "What about her?" "I've been doing some thinking lately about what happened to my pa and my brother, about the war between our peoples, about the hatred that's been eating me alive for months." Patterson's voice was thick with emotion, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on the man's weathered features. "I came here tonight, planning to demand that you send her away, maybe even to threaten you if you refused. But watching her work with that horse, seeing the gentleness in her hands and the patience in her manner, I realized something." "What's that?" "She's not the enemy, Tom. The enemy is the hatred itself, the cycle of revenge that keeps claiming lives on both sides. My pa and brother are dead, and nothing I do to her or any other Apache is going to bring them back." Thomas felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with admiration for Patterson's courage in confronting his own demons. "Jim, it takes a big man to say what you just said. Maybe, or maybe it just takes a tired man who's sick of carrying so much hate." Patterson turned toward Ayana, who had approached within hearing distance. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I've been saying things about you that weren't fair, judging you for things you never did." Ayana met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Patterson, I know about your losses. I grieve for your family, and I understand your anger. If my presence here causes you pain, I will leave." Patterson shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't need to leave. In fact, I hope you'll stay. Maybe having you here, showing folks that Apache and Anglo can work together, will help prevent other families from going through what mine did." The conversation continued for another hour, with Patterson sharing his memories of his father and brother, while Ayana spoke about her own losses and her hopes for the future. By the time the rancher prepared to leave, a tentative friendship had begun to form between two people who had every reason to hate each other. As Patterson mounted his horse, he turned back to Thomas. "You know, Tom, when this all started, I thought you were the biggest fool in the territory. Now I'm thinking you might be the smartest man any of us have ever known." After Patterson and his men rode away, Thomas and Ayana stood together in the gathering darkness, both moved by what they had witnessed. "You see," Ayana said softly, "even the deepest wounds can heal if people are willing to try." Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of hope that he hadn't experienced in years. The path they had chosen was still dangerous and uncertain, but moments like this proved that it was possible for people to overcome their prejudices and find common ground. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Thomas realized that the story of the Apache widow and the rancher who gave her shelter was really just beginning. They had survived the initial challenges and proven that peaceful coexistence was possible, but the real test would come in the months and years ahead as they worked to build something lasting from the foundation they had established. The wind carried the scent of coming winter across the desert, reminding them that change was constant and that survival required constant adaptation. But they would face whatever came together, united by shared purpose and mutual respect that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice rising into the night like a promise or a prayer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight, for the first time in months, Thomas McKenna felt genuinely optimistic about the future. "Continue,"